Thank you very much for inviting me. It was a pleasure to be here 4 years ago, and I was very happy to have been invited again. Talking about bureaucracy, it's actually very interesting what you're saying about the corruption with the Ukrainian drivers, because on the other hand, for me coming here, I have to fill in this tax form, which is really very sort of heavy. I have to go to our tax department, and it has to be signed and 2 copies and all this. So it's very interesting how divergent this is depending who the client is. So, and if you don't have these books, maybe I will send them to you. You make a list of books you don't have.
Oh yeah, sure, I would remember that.
So, what I want to present is a part of a paper which is getting very long now, which I'm writing together with my colleague Jean-Pierre Olivier de Sadan, who some of you might know, somebody who I've been working together with for a very long time, and who's been very inspiring for my work. He's sort of like my bigger brother. He's French, and he is at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Marseille, but he's also attached to a research institute which he founded in Niamey in Niger. And so we noticed that there is actually now quite some work in the anthropology of bureaucracy, but there's nothing systematic on how do you actually study bureaucracy. So we somehow thought it would be maybe a useful exercise, and it would also be useful because, as it was just said by Yolanda, I'm starting a research project, not with Jean-Pierre, this is with other people, Jan Beek and others in Germany, and a linguist as well, on German police and how German police manages linguistic and cultural diversity. In other words, what happens when they meet somebody, encounter somebody who does not speak German, what kind of translation processes are taking place, and what kind of cultural sort of stereotypes are being produced from both sides. So the project actually has people studying the foreigners or being with the foreigners, let's say, and other people who are going to be with the police. We do this in our state near Mainz, in our federal state, in a place called Ludwigshafen, which has a high percentage of foreign-born population. So it's not just on police and migrants, but the migrants are obviously, the recent migrants are an important part of this. So, and let's say my hidden agenda in coming here is to find out who among you is interested in topics like this, and B, who is maybe even working on related topics, because at some point our idea is to try to make this German project into something more comparative. And it occurred to me that Poland would actually be a very interesting case. We have been thinking of France, it would have to be several countries, but so like something like France, Germany, Poland, I think that would be actually quite nice. Anyway, so this is sort of my hidden agenda, and I hope after this talk, and maybe after who of you is going to be in the workshop? Okay, so maybe after the workshop there are some more concrete ideas about this. Okay, now this is the structure of my paper, but I'm only going to, because the paper is very long, and I think I have 45 minutes now. So I always think should leave. We have 1.5 hours altogether, no?
Yeah, so 1 hour is fine. It's just, I say 50 minutes, so that's.
But in my experience, very often in the debates, there are very interesting points being raised. So I don't want to shorten the debate too much, and I can sort of like also talk about maybe if there is an interest in things which I'm not presenting here. So this is the overall structure of my presentation. I'm only going to talk about the first and the second section and a part of the third. But as I said, we can maybe touch some other issues in the discussion. So this is the substructure of part 3, you see. ethnography of bureaucracy as a particular form of the anthropology of organizations, and I'm basically only talking about the A and B, because as you see already, that is very long. Okay, so bureaucracy. What is bureaucracy? We need to have some working definition. So in common parlance, when people speak about bureaucracies, they usually refer to particular types of organizations, very often public, but not necessarily. They can also be private. They're very heavy private bureaucracies. So it can be government, administration, or other public institutions, like universities have a very large bureaucratic side to it, or they can be private, like large enterprises, or even non-profit organizations like Oxfam, so they're also bureaucracies. So that's the this is the sort of like the common parlance definition. For social scientists are a little bit more precise, or anyway, they have a slightly different position. For social scientists, first of all, bureaucracies are the core apparatus of the modern state. That is following Max Weber. It's the central form of rational and legal domination. So there's a high, what we could call a selective affinity between the modern state and bureaucracy, as the state apparatus is organized in bureaucratic form. And in this perspective, more particularly, bureaucracy is a mode of control of populations. Populations are controlled by bureaucracy. For example, I'm being controlled by this form which I have to sign and then have signed by my tax people, and then it has to be signed here again. So that's a mode of control. So there's nothing sort of like fishy going on with money, but there are obviously more vicious types of control in a bureaucratic mode. And more recently, bureaucracy is also the form in which the welfare function of the modern state is realized. Any social security office needs bureaucracy. You have to have lists of people, you have to have eligibility criteria, and so on. So in this perspective, the anthropology of bureaucracy overlaps with the anthropology of the state, the law, and maybe more recently of policy. But then there's, so this is what anthropologists, when they study bureaucracy, have been mainly interested in. So the bulk of the literature is actually on the interface between bureaucrats or bureaucracies and target populations or clients or whatever you want to call them. But what is often forgotten, bureaucracy is also a mode of control of work within organizations. I mean, the bureaucrats themselves are controlled by bureaucracy. There are other forms of control. There's physical coercion. There's control by technical requirements. For example, in order to get into my room, I need a card and I have to sort of put it against the little machine which opens it. So that's also a form of control. There are contractual forms. New public management is a contractual way of controlling people. You sign a contract with your employer that you will reach certain objectives. But interestingly, this has actually increased bureaucratization. And there's also the engineering of intra-organizational culture. Okay, nevertheless, even today with the ascent of culture as an attempt to control work and new public management, all larger modern organizations retain a considerable amount of bureaucracy. So in this perspective, the anthropology of bureaucracy partly overlaps with the anthropology of organizations, of work, and of professions. So we use, as a working definition, bureaucracies, we see them as organizations in which the bureaucratic mode of control predominates. They can be public or they can be private. The only difference, I will come back to this, between public and private organizations or bureaucracies is actually that public bureaucracies partake in the sovereignty claim. I stress the word claim of the state. I'm not saying the state is sovereign in all respects, in any sort of situation, but the state has a claim to sovereignty. And so a police officer, you know, who in many of his sort of practices, what he's doing is actually not referring to the law, or, you know, he acts in terms of situational logics, but he has an additional card which he can play. So public bureaucrats, they have a card. They can sort of like say, okay, if we don't come to any agreement, this is the law. And so that is the only difference that's interesting epistemologically or methodologically, because it means, I will stress that later on, that the anthropology of ethnography, the anthropology of bureaucracy is to a very large extent the same like the anthropology of any organization. Because most of the time bureaucrats, public bureaucrats, they don't run around and think, oh, I'm representing the state. They have lots of other concerns, and the state is there in the last sort of instance. Okay, and the implication of this is that if you do an anthropology of bureaucracy, you should be familiar with the body of knowledge which has been constituted in the anthropology of organizations. Okay, another maybe a little word on terminology. When I speak of anthropology and ethnography, I use this in this context interchangeably. So the anthropology of bureaucracy is basically an ethnography of bureaucracy, and I will come back to this again, even though we may also associate ethnography with other methods. Okay, now, as I said, the anthropology of public bureaucracy, so this is what we are going to concentrate now on. We leave the private aside, even though the private, as I said, in many respects resembles the public, can have two empirical foci. It can focalize on the bureaucracy-population interface, highlighting control of the delivery of public services. But it can also, and this is what anthropologists have mainly done, and in this work, anthropologists have often sided with the client. You know, for example, if you look at migration studies, when they deal, migration studies deal, let's say, with the interface between migrants and policemen, the anthropologists seem to have a natural inclination, I think this is part of our disciplinary heritage, to side with the underdog, with the people we consider the underdog. So most of these ethnographies are written from the migrants' point of view, and what we are pleading for is a little bit to take the bureaucrat as the native. You know, if you have, if the sort of the core mission of anthropology is to describe the world from the native's point of view, then it might be interesting to see the policeman or the tax bureaucrat or even teachers who are also part of bureaucracies as the native and see their little world and try to make sense of their world. So anthropologists of bureaucracy have concentrated on the topics of control of populations and on interface bureaucracies, very often the front office. This is also true for our work in Africa and states at work. We have mainly been interested in what people have called street-level bureaucrats or interface bureaucrats, that is, bureaucrats who have direct contact with the population. But there has been a relative neglect of the back office. So what is happening actually in the interactions between bureaucrats inside, say, a university department? I mean, I've been dean for 4 years now of my faculty, so I had to run the dean's office. That's a little bureaucracy, which has to deal with other bureaucracies in the university, the president's office, other dean's office, and so on. So what is it? And so quite a lot of our time, we were not dealing with students at all, who would sort of be our clients. There are some people who mainly deal with students, or as teachers, we deal mainly with students, but the bureaucrats mainly deal with each other. And so we think that is an interesting sort of perspective to take. So I'm pleading a little bit in this direction. There are people who have started doing this. There is very interesting work on, for example, on migration offices in Germany and so on. But we propose that this should be a little bit expanded. And this is what we are, and by the way, this is what we are going to want to do in our police project. We want to have a very strong focus on sort of the policeman's point of view in their interactions with clients. Okay, so I've said this already. Anthropology of bureaucracy or ethnography of bureaucracy can basically have two empirical foci. It can focus on the interface, the front office, if you like, or the street-level bureaucrats, often combined with a moral siding with the clients. and it can also have a focus inside bureaucracies. And this is, I find this, I'm not saying one is more interesting than the other, but because the latter is a little bit underdeveloped so far, so I find that more sort of like adventurous, sort of to go into that direction. Okay, there are as anthropologists, it's because anthropology being maybe the most existentialist form of the humanities. I mean, we use ourselves as the main research instrument. We go into the field, especially when it is sort of far away fields with our whole personality, our bodies. When you do research in far away places, you have to eat differently. There are different types of jokes being made, maybe addressed differently. So it's very existentialist, or existential, not existentialist, existential anthropology. So by necessity, there's always a moral element in what we are doing, which also, as I said, already stems from our disciplinary heritage. In anthropology, from Malinowski onwards, was very much about rehabilitating the native, show that people, when you sort of get interested in the context in which they live, they have their particular rationalities, which are not sort of inferior to other rationalities. So, in other words, there is sort of like an inbuilt sort of resistance idea or critique idea in anthropology, which people are often very strong about. But I think we should reflect upon this, because it makes it, for example, difficult to study people who we sort of spontaneously maybe dislike. The anthropologist, when you're an anthropologist in Africa, you immediately start disliking the police because they bother you in your work, but then that means also you do not you don't make an attempt at understanding what's going on. There was an anthropologist, Quals van Uffort, who said already in the 1980s, anthropologists have shied away from donning pinstriped suits, go into boardrooms studying powerful people because we don't like them. Okay, so I think it's important to be clear about one's moral political positionings in this work, which I'm not arguing for sort of like doing away with it, but I'm arguing for trying to bracket it up to a point, and at least to be reflexive about it. You cannot neutralize your positioning, I think, but by being reflective about this, you can sort of like analyze a little bit the biases and the selectivity and perception that it creates. Okay, so normative positions towards bureaucracy. If you look at the literature, there are three basic normative positions. One is from the right. When bureaucracy was invented during the 17th, 16th, 17th, 18th century, I mean, okay, that's arguable, but let's say in the context of the modern state, because there were bureaucratic forms which are much older, especially within the Catholic Church. But when the absolute rulers of the 16th, 17th, 18th century started to manage their domains with bureaucrats, people sitting in offices, there was immediately a critique of bureaucracy from the right, from the aristocrats who had lost their power, and then later on also from the position of economic liberalism, laissez-faire. We have that position still today when people say all these environmental regulations are over-regulation. This type of critique very often comes from people who are politically rather on the right, or let's say on the side of the free market, because so that's one type of critique. The other one is from the left. From the left, you rather have critique like that bureaucracy is a knowledge, power, violence machine of domination, or a position, as I said already, which is often taken up by anthropologists who study bureaucracy. So a very famous, well-known example is Gräber. Everybody cites Gräber, even though he has not done any real empirical research on bureaucracy. So he writes these long essays. He doesn't like it. And he tells us that he doesn't like it and repeats that he doesn't like it. But he's very much cited. So this is, I take that as an example, as critique from the left. You could say James Scott, for example. James Scott is not so much writing about bureaucracy, but he's writing about bureaucratic procedures, like ordering the world according to certain categories. And you can, in my opinion, you cannot understand James Scott if you don't realize that there's a very strong tradition of left-wing populism in America, in the United States, which is against central government and all this. And James Scott is very much sort of like an erudite anarchist in this sort of respect. It's, by the way, very interesting if you think about, so if somebody sort of, the philosophical baggage with which we come into the fields. I mean, me as a German, we have a very strong reference to the law all the time. And then you have somebody American like James Scott, who has that sort of like tradition of sort of anti-federal government resistance. So what that actually means when you do empirical research. So anyway, so these two critical positions from the right and to the left. My position would rather be to see bureaucracy as very ambivalent. Bureaucracy has two sides, like Bourdieu, who said the state has two hands. There's a protective side and there's an oppressive side, and they very often go with each other because, for example, the welfare function of the modern state, social security, has also a subjectivation aspect. It's not just giving money to poor people, but it's also classifying them, making them behave in a particular way, and so on. So bureaucracy can be a protector of the individual and of universal rules against despotic arbitrariness, a little bit like the law, but it can also be it can be a liberator from pre-given social bonds. For example, I've been in the committee of a thesis the other day where somebody has studied family law in Benin in West Africa, and where she shows that the introduction of modern family law has largely profited young women, for example, in heritage conflicts. In a situation where sort of the family logic was very much biased towards the older men. Somebody dies, and then there's a heritage, and then the older brother is sort of shared among them. But modern family law has been a liberating factor for young women, especially young women, to claim their share. So bureaucracy can be liberating, but it can at the same time also be oppressive. So it's this is sort of Marxism, if you like, or dialectical materialism, or at least dialectic. You should see it in a dialectical way, bureaucracy. We have these propositions, which sum a little bit up what I've said already. We propose, when I say we, is Jean-Pierre, Olivier de Sanon, and me, we propose to take the bureaucrat as the native, in the Malinowskian sense, and acknowledge her agency. I mean, bureaucrats are not simply tools, mindless tools of they're carriers of rules. They have their own agency. We should take into account the double phase of bureaucracy as a form of domination, as well as of protection, liberation, and all the ensuing ambivalences. We also want to highlight bureaucracies as heterogeneous social fields of contention and focus on differences between organization, ideology, and practices. I will come back to that. And then we also strongly think that you cannot do an anthropology of bureaucracy or of the state just by limiting yourself to anthropological or ethnographic methods. Because ethnographic methods is like looking at a construction site. You have these construction sites in town, and you have these fences around it, and there's so little holes in it, and then you see sometimes children or people of my age, old age pensioners, will look at this construction and what's going on there, and you obviously see only a small part of it. So to have an overall picture, you have to link these micro observations we do as ethnographers, and that can only be done with the help of other knowledge and also of general theory. So we should in particular engage with historiography, the history of administrative apparatuses and bureaucracies, with sociology, and also with administrative science, even though administrative science, which sometimes is a part of political science, sometimes independent, is in fact often very normative. So that's the problem with it, so one has to sort of like strip it of its normativity. Okay, so that was my introduction, just to remind you. So that was the introduction. Now we come to part 2. Well, I'll try to be relatively short on this. So, in many respects, doing an ethnography of bureaucracies is very much the same. I mean, you do the same things or try to do the same things that you do in general anthropology. In general ethnography, you try to do long-term field work, participant observations. Okay, there are problems with access, obviously. But that should be the goal. You don't just go in and do 1 week of interviews and then you come up with a big theory. You try to observe people in their everyday life, their everyday work. You try to talk to them outside formal situations and private discussions and so on. So the politics of fieldwork is very much the same as in general anthropology. And then this is like a very strong idea I hold. I mean, what is anthropology? Anthropology is very much ethnographically based anthropology. It's very much discovering the unknown. I mean, contrary to when you do a quantitative survey, you actually know already about the phenomenon. And then you just want to find out how it is distributed over a given population, because you ask very pointed questions. So the general, the general outline of what you know in category terms is already there. But in ethnography, you go into the field. I mean, you have a research objective. Obviously, you don't go just in naively. I'm not pleading for this. You have your research concept. But you are prepared to discover things which you have not even thought about before. So anthropology is very much about discovering the unknown. I don't know, for example, you have organizations and they have sort of like a place where people meet for coffee. I've seen you have something like that as well. And then sort of you could suddenly realize how, I don't know, gender is being performed or hierarchies are being produced around the coffee machine. You did not necessarily have that in your original research outline, and to say it a little bit more sort of like in sociological jargon, so anthropology is grounded theory production. You referring to Glaser and Strauss in qualitative sociology. You try to produce knowledge on the basis of empirical observations, obviously in conversation with larger theories, but you do not go into the field to test theories as such. You might be aware of them in your background, back of your head, but so it's very much about, this is the adventurous part of anthropology. You go there to find out things which you had not known and which are against common sense and your own common sense. I remember I wrote a paper a few years ago on methodology, and I used Zidane in 2006 when he did this head kick with Maserati, the Italian, in the World Cup, so apparently there was a whole sequence of discussions between Maserati, the Italian defender, and Zidane. You all know Zidane, no? Or maybe it's too.
Yes.
Yeah, so apparently these guys had been sort of like wrapping each other. Maserati was pulling the shirt of Zidane, and then Zidane said, well, if you like my shirt so much, I will give it to you afterwards signed, which is a way of trying to create hierarchy. I'm the big guy, I give you my shirt. And then Maserati, he countered and he said, I would prefer your sister. So obviously this is very sexist and quite shocking. So when I wrote this, and then my anthropology colleagues were, some were a bit sort of like, oh, this is sort of, it's very This was very bad of Maserati, and how could he have done this? It's terrible. How can he say something like this? And if you look at the literature in sociology of sport, it's a very, it's called trash talking. There's actually a term for it. That professional basketball players and football players all the time try to destabilize each other. So it's the whole strategy, and actually the professionals are also trained not to sort of like react to it. So actually, Zidane was very unprofessional. So in that little world of football players, it was a very banal sort of comment, and my anthropology colleagues didn't like the word banal, as if I'm more sort of like excusing it. I'm just saying sort of you discover things which you are not prepared to discover coming from, most anthropologists come from middle class background and have sort of certain moral convictions, what can be said, what cannot be said. Anyway, so just as an example. Then the other, I think the other sort of like strong proposition we have is that there should be epistemological equity when you study a field. I mean, you have to develop this in the anthropology of development. I mean, historically, the anthropology of development has been anthropology which has worked in the interest, or let's say, in the service of development institutions. So what happens is that you have a development institution, let's say the World Bank, and they are building a dam, or they introduce, let's say, they introduce a new crop, and the crop doesn't work. You know, people don't accept the crop, and then the agronomists say, oh, there must be some cultural barriers to it. Let's call in the anthropologists or the sociologists to explain to us why people have this resistance to these crops. So it's very much sort of like a fire brigade function of anthropology. When things do not work in the context of development, call in the anthropologists to tell us what the cultural barriers in people's heads are towards progress. So this is sort of like the old, or one strand of old anthropology of development. What we have been arguing for since the 1980s, that when you do an anthropology of development, you also study the World Bank people. You know, it's a social field of interaction between different groups, which we call strategic groups, and you can have sort of like a preliminary outline of what the major strategic groups are, and you do not sort of study one group in the interest of the other. You know, you take them all. You have sort of equidistance in French. So from all actors. So it's epistemological equity, and I think we should also have that when we study bureaucracies. We should have the same epistemological equity to all actors as far as that possible. At the same time, we argue for methodological populism, which means you enter the ethnographer. Ethnography is by nature actor-centered because you talk to people, to individual actors. So that's methodological populism, if you like, which is not the same as ideological populism. Methodological populism is you have an actor-centered approach in the sense that you take the actor serious. You start with the presupposition he must have good reasons for doing what he is doing. So some weird practice. I mean, this tax people or so, but they must have good reasons for doing what they are doing. So you take the actor serious, that's methodological populism, but, and you could also call that rationality in context. You assume, the zero hypothesis of ethnography is to assume that people must have good reasons for doing what they are doing. It's rationality in context. That's Evans Pritchard with the Azande, for example, where he shows that witchcraft and magic make very much a lot of sense in the local context, and it doesn't mean people are sort of intellectually backwards. But in their context, it makes sense and has many different social functions. But it doesn't mean that you say the actor you're working with is morally or politically right. Let's come back to the point I made already. So if you study a police-migrant interaction, you sort of assume as a zero hypothesis that both parts of the interaction have their rationality in context. Okay, let me see whether. Okay, so in other words, the anthropology of bureaucracy is very much like the anthropology follows, in many respects, basic outlines of general anthropology. But then obviously you have to make particular choices, like in any field. For example, you have to decide which organizational subunits you study. For example, there's a very famous, very much cited book by Didier Fassin, now on the police, Enforcing Order, which is a very good ethnography of French police, but it's not an ethnography of the French police. It's an ethnography of a particular police force in France. And sort of the problem with this book is that it extrapolates to police, first in France in general, and then in the world. He has this very sort of vicious Brigade Anticriminalité, BAC, who are sort of known within the police for their viciousness and their sort of like oppressiveness, and they hit first and talk later, so to speak. But that is not, I mean, the question is, can you actually extrapolate from that to police in France in general, or even to neoliberal policing? So you have to choose your organizational subfields. If you study at university, I mean, you have to sort of, there are lots of different, large organizations have lots of different sub-units, and as an ethnographer you cannot study them all, so you have to make a choice, and then you have to think about the particular selectivity and bias that creates. You choose certain strategic groups and actors. You also have to choose your observational sites. For example, you could sit in meetings. For example, if I wanted to do a study of your department, I could sort of ask to be allowed to sit in meetings and make, if I understood Polish, which I don't, but let's say I was somebody who understands Polish, so I could make notes, observe how people sit, who speaks most, and who is allowed to interrupt the other and who is not allowed, and all these things, so that we can develop sort of a theory of informal or formal hierarchies. And so on, but I could also go to your coffee machine place, or I could talk to retired people from the department who would tell me things which I have, which maybe in this more official context here would not be said, or I meet, maybe some of you are in a whatever yoga club, you meet in a yoga club, so there are these sort of networks which are sort of beyond the organization, so I could try to become part of that, and then I could also have another entry by different materialities and objects. I could study how objects are being used. For example, the usage of stamps. When are things being stamped, and where do these stamps come from? What is the architectural outline? So these choices, every anthropologist has to make them in any field, but they have a particular sort of obviously tinge to it in the anthropology of bureaucracy. And then you can only do serious anthropology of bureaucracy, as I said already, if you use mixed methods. At some point you also have to study documents, you can study them for their content, so then that would mean discourse analysis, which is not among our usual methods which we learn, at least not in my department. That's more the communication people who do things like that, so you have to learn from them, or you have to do some quantitative work, you could do some surveys, and so on. So ethnography may dominate, but it cannot be the only method. Okay, now I come to my third part, anthropology of bureaucracy as a particular form of the anthropology of organizations. So interestingly, it was interesting for me to discover this, that, I mean, usually when we present the history of anthropology to our first year students, we have sort of like a major narrative. It goes from the 19th century, evolutionism, then at some point there's Boas and Malinowski, then there's Clifford Geertz, Ruth Benedict maybe in between, and so we have this sort of like present anthropology as a huge stream going for history, major stream, and then you have little side streams. For example, anthropology of organization. At some point, people also got interested in organizations and so on. But that is a little bit false as a picture, because the anthropology of organizations already started in the 1920s. So at the same time as Malinowski and Boas did their empirical research. And interestingly, organization studies as such were co-created by anthropologists. So in the 1920s, there was a huge research project on an electricity company in General Electrics in the United States, and the team that studied labor relations in the electricity company was actually made up of psychologists and of anthropologists. There was a man called Warner who had studied Australian tribes before, and who was part of that team. And people wanted to find out what affects labor productivity. I'll come back to this in a second. But first, to say the anthropology of organizations is not a little side stream of anthropology. Historically speaking, it was created at the same moment as sort of the modern paradigm of anthropology, a la Malinowski and Boas, was created. And the interesting thing is, in many senses, or in some senses, the anthropology of organization, considered as a side stream, we never talk about this in the introduction to anthropology, it's sort of relegated to specialized courses, was actually epistemologically and methodologically advanced over mainstream anthropology. Why was it advanced? For example, it took the modern world as an object of study. You know, at a time when anthropologists defined their object of study as traditional societies, they actually explicitly looked at modern phenomena, which anthropology only did, towards the end of the 20th century, mainstream anthropology. People worked in teams, which goes very much, anthropology has a very individualist sort of ideology. The idea is very much, as Susan Sontag once said, the anthropologist as hero. You know, Evans Bridgers, he takes a boat to Alexandria, he takes another boat up the Rhine, up the Nile, then he rides on a camel, and then he walks, and after 3 weeks he's with the Azanda, but he's all on his own. And then after, I don't know how many, he spent a few, not quite a year I think, he comes back the same way, and then he reports things, and everybody's awed, and people reporting from these far away places. And then the main sort of like truth criterion is, I was there. You know, it's true because I was there. I've seen it, which is I don't want to belittle this. I'm very much into also this empirist sort of conviction that when you have seen things. That's already not bad, instead of just sort of like having heard about it. But it's very individualist, that's what I want to say. Anthropologists are not used to work in teams. There's no methodology for anthropological teamwork. Teamwork, if there's teamwork, is very often ex post. You might have a research project where people do their individual fieldwork, and then afterwards they try to compare results. But to do fieldwork together, to have a comparative method in fieldwork, is basically non-existent, I think. Maybe I'm wrong, but I haven't seen anything. And then also these people, anthropologists of organizations, they worked in interdisciplinary teams, with psychologists. So and in these teams, to say I was there was not enough as a methodology, because then they had to be more explicit about their methods. I mean, how do you know that what you are telling us is true? I mean, what are your plausibility criteria, and so on. So the anthropology of organization is actually a very interesting field to look at in this respect. Okay, now the major theorem of the anthropology of organizations was that you cannot understand an organization simply on the basis of its formal structure. When they did these so-called Hawthorne experiments with General Electrics, they found out that there are lots of informal things going on between the girls in the wiring room, for example, the young women, let's say, no, sorry, not the girls, young women in the wiring room, how they sort of relate to each other informally, what kind of sort of factions there are in a team, and so on. And this is completely outside formal structures. And this has had, according to them, a very high impact on labor productivity. We can forget about this labor productivity. That was the type of also some research which was very much done in the interest of management. So I don't want, we should sort of like bracket this. But the basic idea behind this is that you cannot understand an organization only functions partially on the basis of its official structure. The official structure just gives a frame, and it's very often referred to, but people do many things for completely different reasons. And there's an American anthropologist who later he called that bureaucratic repair. For example, in my work as a dean, so when I did my auto ethnography, we often, let's say we have a meeting, a selection committee meeting. We want to appoint somebody new professor of medieval history. Then we have different candidates, and then it's very clear that some candidates are more sort of popular with the people than others, and so on. And not all it's quite obvious that all the arguments which are being said in this meeting are sort of like officially acceptable. So me as heading the meeting, I say, well, I need for the notes of the meeting, I need a series of arguments which are defendable, sort of like a level higher up. When we go to the academic senate and defend our choice, which doesn't mean that we disrespect formal rules. I mean, we take them into account, but we also take into account other criteria. So in the end, but what in the end is being presented is sort of like an official picture, which only partly reflects what was actually going on in that meeting. Sometimes the colleague would say, "Oh, isn't this?" And then, well, this is not an protokollierbares argument. It's not an argument. It's not an argument which can enter our notes. Here we have to find another argument. Or to put it positively, I call central administration. I say we want to do this and that. And personnel administration said we cannot do this. It's impossible. I say, well, I'm very often, most cases, I would say, okay, well, too bad. There's some personnel laws, but sometimes when it's very important and I have the feeling there's maybe some leeway, I would say, well, I'm very sorry, the Dean of Faculty number 7, please find some way of making this happen. And then the guy would say, okay, I call you back tomorrow. And then he said, okay, if we do it, then we have to argue it differently and so on. So bureaucratic rules are a little bit like cards you play. So and so the entry side of the game is, I mean, you can have strong cards and you can have weak cards. But who wins and who loses depends also very much on the way you play these cards. So it's not the cards, you have a distribution of cards in a card game, and then so everybody put up their cards, it doesn't mean the one who has the strongest cards wins, because then it depends on how skillfully is playing this. So there are very many different cards in the game, and there are also, if you like, there are different games played at the same time. The game, or it's like a complex game which follows certain rules, or in other words, you could also say even the rules which you apply are cards, because in many situations, Gluckman has been very strong on this, to sort of decide in a situation depends on which rules you evoke, and that's also true in a bureaucratic environment, because the official norms already of an organization, very often they're in conflict. And there is an American anthropologist, Hilbert, who has called this bureaucratic repair, that lots of work that the bureaucrats do is actually trying to justify decisions they have taken for a host of reasons, but to make them appear as following exclusively a bureaucratic logic, bureaucratic repair. Okay, now these informal practices which people follow, they should not be confused with arbitrariness. It's not that the bureaucrat sort of one day is in a bad mood, then he does this, and the other day he does something else. So these informal practice is they are also socially constructed. For example, I attended a conference on policing in Europe quite a few years ago, and I thought there was a very interesting contribution by young Frenchmen about controllers in the Parisian subway. So controllers, they're not police, but they're like para-police. So they go around and control people's tickets. And they would treat people quite differently. They would not simply apply the rule that everybody has to have a ticket, but depending on circumstances, they would be more lenient or more sort of strict. And one major aspect was apparently respect. You know, if you meet somebody who has no ticket, but he is very respectful in a certain way of talking to you, and then you might let him go, depending also on status of the person. For example, they let me usually go because I'm so nervous. Whereas my sons would not get away with it probably. So it depends also very much on states, but it also depends on your acting, how you act in that situation. And so a very important aspect of the work of these controllers is respect. They want to be respected by people, which is quite understandable. You know, it's nothing wrong about this. So if the interaction goes wrong, then there is sort of like a key sentence when the controller and the guy doesn't show the respect which the controller thinks is due to him. He would say, "I'm very sorry, there's nothing else I can do for you," and then he applies the law. So the law, again, it's like a card which he plays. You know, he has this in the background, but he doesn't play it all the time. So these informal ways of behaving, they are socially constructed. I mean, they follow sociological rules, which we try to detect. Okay, and this is why it is important to study. I think I have to talk for 1 hour almost, no? This is, for example, why it's very important. When people learn the official rules of being a policeman or being a tax official, they learn it in formal training. But there's a whole sort of process of learning the informal norms, which is done usually on the job, which you can call professional socialization. And this is why the people who are undergoing professional socialization are a very interesting group to talk to, because then they suddenly see what they learned at school and what they have, what is happening on the ground. Let's say as a policeman or a teacher or so, it's not exactly the same, and because they are more aware of the conflicts between that, whereas somebody who has already been professionally socialized, for him it seems obvious that certain things have to be done like they are being done. Okay, now maybe I leave this out. Professional culture, we can talk about it. This creates, I mean, these reflections then create particular topics that could be studied, which is only a selected sort of list of things. Professional socialization, I talked about occupational fiddles. There's a very interesting book by a British anthropologist called Mars, like the planet Mars, M-R-S, learning how to cheat. And he said, you have to assume that in any professional position, on any level, people have a mixture of motivations and interests of doing what they are doing. And different types of jobs allow you different types of job satisfaction. He calls that fiddles. Some of these fiddles might be corruption. I mean, for example, in our work on African policemen, mainly policemen, or also customs officials, it's very interesting to see the customs officials, they have a mental map of the country with the different stations where they could be posted to. And the mental map is in terms of, they have a word juicy. There are juicy positions and dry positions. And the juicy positions are, for example, at the frontier, are positions where you can generate extra income. Whereas the dry positions, if you, for example, if as a gendarme you have to to protect the National Assembly. You know, a huge part of the gendarmerie is used for standing, you know, in front of the National Assembly building to protect it. There's not much juice in it because whereas if you are at the frontier with Nigeria, lots of trade going on, it's more juicy. So people have sort of like mental maps of the different value of sort of positions which are not completely but partly independent on what the actual job is about. Then that was in the first stage. In the second stage, we found out that it's more complicated. It's not every policeman is interested in corruption. For example, some said, for us, the post in front of the National Assembly is more interesting because I want to. I'm going to university in parallel to my work. I want to take a law degree. I'm a policeman, you know. I want to take a law degree, and when I sit in front of the National Assembly, I have lots of free time. It gives me a lot of free time to do other things, which, you know, so these are all jobs allow for different fiddles. So that's another interesting sort of topic to look at. Then there's also informal accountabilities. Again, we discovered this in Africa, but you can re-import it into Europe. In Africa, very often you have people, when you find out this guy is in some office, but he was actually posted there. Among my own PhD students, I have one case. He's an anthropologist, and the other anthropologist was also my PhD student, became foreign minister. So this colleague of his was posted in the foreign ministry, even though he has no formal training as a diplomat. So that creates particular accountability to big men who have been responsible for you to gain your position. But you have that in Europe as well. It could be part. So in other words, there is an accountability towards some person or institution outside your own bureaucracy. But you have in Europe, it could be political parties. You know, you are somewhere because of party connections, so that creates the accountability. It can also be other informal networks. For example, in Mainz, in my hometown where I live, there's a very strong carnival culture. You have all these carnival associations, and at some point you realize you have lots of people in our university administration who are in the same carnival club. You know, and then if it's an opening, then the member from the same club, they would know maybe earlier than the others, and there is some way of saying, okay, you know, we help you to get this job. So informal accountabilities outside the administration is an interesting topic to study. Now all this points to the importance of ethnography, because if you say you cannot understand an organization without understanding the informal processes going on, then you need ethnography. There's no other method which can get close to this informal practice. You cannot do this by statistical methods or just sort of surveys. Okay, this was it. I think I stop here in order not to overburden this situation, and thank you very much for your patience.